Do you remember sneaking into abandoned buildings with nothing but a flashlight or riding in the back of a pickup truck without a second thought? The 1970s was a world where teenage freedom often mattered more than rules, and many of the things young people did every day seemed completely normal. But why would those same activities now lead to fines, lawsuits, or even criminal charges? To find out, we're unlocking 19 unforgettable memories from the 1970s that would be illegal today. Riding in the back of pickup trucks. If you were a teenager in the 1970s, there was a good chance your favorite seat wasn't inside the truck at all. It was in the bed. On warm summer evenings, you and your friends would climb into the back of a pickup truck, sit on the metal floor, and head down country roads with the wind blasting against your face. There were no seatbelts, no warning labels, and certainly no parents insisting you buckle up. You laughed, told stories, and watched telephone poles blur past under a sky that seemed to stretch forever. It felt like pure freedom, the kind that existed before every risk came with a rule. Today, in many states, allowing teenagers to ride in the back of a moving pickup truck can result in fines or legal penalties. Back then, it was just another Friday night. Hitchhiking across town. Long before ride-sharing apps and smartphones, there was a much simpler way to get from one place to another. You stuck out your thumb and hoped someone stopped. For many teenagers in the 1970s, hitchhiking wasn't considered reckless. It was normal. Whether you were trying to get to a friend's house, a concert, or the other side of town, all it took was standing by the roadside and waiting for a passing driver. Most of the time, someone eventually pulled over. You'd hop in, exchange a few words, and continue on your way. Looking back, it's hard to imagine how much trust people placed in complete strangers. Today, many parents would be horrified by the idea, and in some places hitchhiking is restricted or heavily discouraged for safety reasons. But in the 70s, it was simply part of growing up. Cruising Main Street all night. Before social media, before streaming services, and before teenagers spent evenings staring at screens, there was Main Street. On weekend nights, young people piled into their cars and drove the same stretch of road again and again. The radio played through open windows, neon signs reflected off polished paint, and muscle cars rumbled beneath glowing streetlights. The destination didn't matter. The drive was the event. You waved at friends, checked out who was in town, and hoped someone would notice your car. Entire communities turned cruising into a social ritual. It was part car show, part social network, and part teenage freedom. But as traffic increased and cities became more crowded, many towns began passing anti-cruising ordinances to reduce congestion. What was once a harmless pastime could now earn you a ticket in certain places. Roaming the neighborhood until dark. There was a time when teenagers left home in the morning, and their parents had absolutely no idea where they were until dinner. In the 1970s, that wasn't unusual. You grabbed your bicycle, met up with friends, and disappeared into the neighborhood for hours. Maybe you played baseball in an empty lot, explored a creek behind the woods, or rode across town just because you felt like it. The only rule was simple: be home when the streetlights came on. There were no cell phones, no location trackers, and no constant check-ins. If your parents needed you, they couldn't text you. They simply trusted you'd come back. It was a level of independence that feels almost unimaginable today. In many ways, it was one of the last generations to experience true unsupervised freedom. Exploring abandoned buildings. Every town seemed to have one. An old factory at the edge of town. An abandoned school with broken windows. A house everyone claimed was haunted. For teenagers in the 1970s, places like these were impossible to resist. On a Saturday afternoon, you and your friends might sneak inside armed with nothing more than curiosity and a flashlight. Every hallway felt like a mystery. Every creaking floorboard sounded like an adventure waiting to happen. Half the excitement came from not knowing what you would find. The other half came from knowing you probably weren't supposed to be there. Today, entering abandoned properties is considered trespassing and can lead to serious legal consequences. But back then, countless teenagers spent their weekends exploring forgotten places, chasing stories and memories that stayed with them for decades. Buying cigarettes for their parents. If you grew up in the 1970s, there was a good chance you were sent to the corner store with a handwritten note and a few dollars. The mission was simple: buy a pack of cigarettes for mom or dad. No one thought much about it. The cashier knew your family, glanced at the note, and handed over a pack of Marlboros or Camels without asking questions. Some kids were barely 12 or 13 years old, yet they walked out carrying cigarettes as casually as a loaf of bread. It wasn't seen as irresponsible. It was just another household errand. Looking back, it feels almost unbelievable. Today, tobacco sales are heavily regulated, identification is required, and a child attempting the same thing would be turned away immediately. But in the 70s, it was a completely ordinary part of daily life. Smoking in school bathrooms. Long before vape detectors and zero-tolerance policies, one of the most common places to find cigarette smoke in a high school was the bathroom. If you pushed open the door between classes, you might find a small group of students leaning against the sinks, talking, laughing, and passing around cigarettes. The air was thick with smoke, and surprisingly, it wasn't always a secret. In some schools, teachers knew it was happening and often looked the other way unless things got out of hand. Smoking was so common in American culture that many adults didn't see teenage smoking as the crisis it would later become. Today, the situation couldn't be more different. Most schools enforce strict anti-smoking policies, and students caught smoking can face suspension or serious disciplinary action. Back then, it was simply part of the school experience. Drinking beer at high school parties. For many teenagers in the 1970s, the weekend meant finding out whose parents were away and heading over for a party. The garage door was open, rock music blasted from oversized speakers, and coolers filled with beer sat against the wall. Friends gathered, danced, talked, and stayed out far later than most parents would allow today. While not every party involved alcohol, many did, and the atmosphere was often far more relaxed than modern standards would permit. Adults sometimes suspected what was happening, but enforcement was inconsistent and attitudes were different. It was viewed by some as harmless teenage experimentation rather than a major legal concern. Today, parents who knowingly allow underage drinking on their property can face serious legal consequences. In the 1970s, however, these parties were a familiar part of teenage social life. Buying beer without a real ID. There was a time when buying beer could be surprisingly easy, especially in small towns where everybody knew everybody. A teenager might walk into a local convenience store, grab a six-pack from the cooler, and head to the counter without anyone demanding multiple forms of identification. Some used older siblings' IDs. Others relied on looking older than they were. And sometimes, a friendly cashier simply didn't ask many questions. The process lacked the electronic scanners, databases, and strict verification systems that exist today. Looking back, it seems almost impossible to imagine. Modern retailers face severe penalties for selling alcohol to minors, and identification checks are routine nearly everywhere. But during the 1970s, enforcement varied widely, creating opportunities that many teenagers were more than willing to take advantage of. Going to concerts with almost no security. Attending a concert in the 1970s was a very different experience from what it is today. You bought a paper ticket, walked up to the entrance, and usually headed straight inside. There were no metal detectors, no bag inspections, and no long security lines stretching around the building. Once inside, teenagers packed themselves into massive crowds, standing shoulder to shoulder as rock bands shook the arena with thunderous sound. The atmosphere felt raw, spontaneous, and unpredictable. People focused on the music rather than security procedures. Looking back, it's remarkable how much trust existed at large public events. Today, concerts involve extensive safety measures designed to protect attendees from a wide range of threats. But in the 1970s, most fans simply showed up, handed over a ticket, and walked through the doors without a second thought. Evolving school discipline. In the 1970s, disciplinary standards were significantly stricter than today. Schools frequently employed traditional methods of correction to manage student behavior, which were often backed by formal policy and parental support. Many at the time believed these firm approaches were necessary to build character and ensure respect within the classroom. However, as educational philosophies shifted, psychologists and educators began to question the efficacy of fear-based discipline. Research increasingly suggested that such methods did not foster positive long-term growth. This realization led to a major cultural shift, resulting in the implementation of modern, restorative practices in school systems worldwide. Today, the focus has moved away from punitive measures toward fostering supportive and safe learning environments. Skipping school all day. Playing hooky in the 1970s was often much easier than it would be today. There were no attendance apps, automated text alerts, or instant notifications sent to parents. If a teenager decided to skip class, there was a good chance nobody would know until hours later. Some headed to the local pinball arcade to drop quarters into the newest machines. Others wandered through shopping malls, browsed record stores, or spent the day hanging out with friends. It felt like a small taste of freedom and independence. Of course, getting caught still meant trouble, but the chances of slipping through the cracks were much higher than they are now. Modern schools track attendance far more closely, making it difficult to disappear unnoticed. In the 1970s, however, a determined teenager could sometimes vanish for an entire day. Riding bikes without helmets. Every neighborhood in the 1970s seemed filled with the sound of bicycle tires humming across pavement. From the moment school ended until the streetlights came on, kids and teenagers rode everywhere. They raced down steep hills, jumped homemade ramps, and explored miles from home without a second thought. And almost none of them wore helmets. Protective gear simply wasn't part of the experience. Scraped knees, bruised elbows, and occasional crashes were considered normal parts of childhood. Parents worried about you getting home on time far more than whether you had a helmet on your head. Over the years, growing awareness of head injuries changed public attitudes dramatically. Today, many communities require helmets for young riders. But in the 1970s, riding bareheaded was simply what everyone did. Drinking and driving was more tolerated. Looking back, one of the most sobering differences between the 1970s and today involves how society once treated drunk driving. Not as the deadly crime we now recognize it to be, but as an uncomfortable reality that too many people simply shrugged off. After an evening at a bar or a neighborhood gathering, plenty of adults grabbed their keys without a second thought. Public awareness campaigns were nearly non-existent. Enforcement was inconsistent. And many Americans genuinely underestimated how dangerous those decisions were. Teenagers growing up in that era witnessed behavior that would be completely unacceptable today. As accident statistics climbed and advocacy groups like MADD began pushing for real change in the early 1980s, public attitudes finally started shifting. Today, driving under the influence carries serious criminal penalties. Back then, society tolerated what it never should have. If any of these memories sound familiar, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear what growing up in the 70s was really like where you lived. Riding without seatbelts. If you climbed into a car as a teenager in the 1970s, chances are nobody reminded you to buckle up because hardly anyone did. Seatbelts existed, but many people ignored them. Kids stretched out across the back seat, leaned against the windows, or even slept on the rear shelf beneath the back windshield during long road trips. Safety wasn't the first thing on anyone's mind. The focus was on getting where you were going and having fun along the way. Parents rarely checked, and many drivers believed seatbelts were uncomfortable or unnecessary. It wasn't until crash studies and public safety campaigns revealed how many lives could be saved that attitudes began to change. Today, failing to wear a seatbelt can result in a ticket in most states. Back then, it was simply how people rode. Packing 8 friends into one car. For teenagers in the 1970s, a 5-passenger car was often treated as a suggestion rather than a rule. If there was a football game, a concert, or a Friday night party, everyone piled in. One friend sat in the middle of the front bench seat. 2 squeezed into the trunk area of a station wagon. Others sat on each other's laps in the back. Somehow, 8 or even 9 teenagers could fit into a single vehicle, and nobody seemed particularly concerned about it. The goal wasn't comfort. It was making sure nobody got left behind. The radio played, windows were rolled down, and the entire car shook with laughter. Today, overloading a vehicle like that would violate multiple safety laws and could lead to serious penalties. But in the 70s, it was practically a teenage tradition. 18. Playing on construction sites. Every town seemed to have a construction site that attracted curious teenagers like a magnet. To adults, it was a dangerous work zone. To kids, it looked like the greatest playground ever built. There were giant piles of dirt to climb, deep trenches to explore, steel beams stretching into the sky, and unfinished structures that felt like secret fortresses. After school or on weekends, groups of teenagers often slipped through gaps in fences to investigate. The danger was part of the excitement. Looking back, it's easy to see how risky it really was. Falls, heavy equipment, and unstable structures could turn an adventure into a tragedy in seconds. Today, construction sites are heavily secured, and entering one without permission is considered trespassing. But for many teens in the 1970s, they were unforgettable playgrounds of imagination and risk. The 1970s gave teenagers a level of freedom that feels almost unbelievable today. Some of those memories bring back smiles and stories that people still share decades later. Others remind us how much society has changed and how differently we view safety, responsibility, and growing up. Together, they paint a picture of a generation that experienced a world unlike any other. Which one surprised you the most? And which ones do you remember doing yourself? Share your stories in the comments below.